green light blinked on above the scale, and a farm truck eased forward onto the platform, tires settling with a soft groan against the steel deck. Emmett Coates watched the numbers climb on the digital display, checked them against the order ticket clipped to his board, and waved the driver forward toward the loading lane once the weight matched. Behind that truck, 3 more waited in a loose line along the gravel apron, engines idling, farmers leaning out their windows to talk to each other while they waited their turn. Inside the warehouse, most of the bulk bins sat nearly empty, not because business was slow, but because almost everything that had come in that week already had a name attached to it before the delivery truck ever showed up. Emmett didn't think about it much anymore, the way a person stops noticing something once it becomes ordinary. But 3 years earlier, on a muddy lot with a crooked sign that used to read Feed and Seed, almost nobody in the county would have believed this scale would ever run again, let alone matter to anyone. The building had sat empty since the flood, a bad one that came through Caldwell County and put nearly 3 feet of water through half the businesses along the low stretch of Route 14. The feed store had never reopened after that. The owner had let the insurance lapse the year before the water came, and once the cleanup bills started adding up against inventory that was already ruined, he simply walked away and let the county take it for back taxes. By the time it came up at the tax auction, the building had been sitting closed for almost 4 years, and it looked every bit of it. The auctioneer, a woman named Sandra Query, worked through a list of tax-forfeited parcels on a hot Saturday morning. Folding chairs set up in the gravel lot outside the courthouse annex. Farmers sat fanning themselves with auction flyers. A few contractors walked the property list with clipboards, and here and there a scrap buyer eyed the more rundown lots with obvious interest. When Sandra got to the old feed store, she held up a photograph that didn't do the place any favors. The waterline was still visible on the exterior brick, a faint gray stain running around the whole building about knee-high. The old sign hung crooked from one bracket, half the letters faded past reading, though you could still make out Feed and S if you squinted. Pallets sat stacked and rotting near the loading doors, and grass had pushed up through cracks in the asphalt apron out front. $1,200 for a building that already tried to float away? Someone called out before Sandra had even opened the bidding, and a ripple of laughter moved through the folding chairs. "You bought the flood with it," another voice added. "Hope the fish pay rent," somebody else said. And that one got the biggest laugh of the morning. Sandra opened at $2,000. Nobody raised a card. She dropped it and dropped it again, working her way down through the silence until she landed on $1,200. Emmett sat near the back of the crowd, 20 years old, wearing a shirt still smelling faintly of feed dust from his shift that morning at Hallbrook Farm Supply, where he'd worked the counter and helped load trucks for almost 2 years. He'd come to the auction mostly out of curiosity, tagging along with his Uncle Dorsey, who ran a modest cattle operation on leased pasture outside town and had been eyeing a used stock trailer further down the list. Emmett hadn't planned on bidding on anything, but something about the flooded feed store kept catching his attention while everyone around him treated it like a punchline. He'd delivered orders to that same building years earlier, back before the flood, back when it was still open, and he remembered the layout well enough to picture what was still standing under all that damage. Sandra called out $1,200 one more time, sounding ready to move the lot along without a sale at all. Emmett raised his hand. The laughter started almost immediately. "Son, you sure about that?" An older farmer near the front asked, twisting around in his chair to look at him. Dorsey, sitting beside him, didn't laugh, but his expression made it clear he had questions of his own that would come later away from the crowd. Nobody bid against him. Sandra brought the gavel down, and just like that, Emmett owned a flooded, gutted, 4-year abandoned feed store for $1,200. A few of the farmers were still shaking their heads about it as Emmett walked back to his truck, one of them muttering something about needing hip waders more than a bidder number. That evening, Emmett's mother, Renata, sat across the kitchen table from him with her arms crossed, listening to him explain what he'd done. $1,200 wasn't a fortune, but it was most of what he'd managed to save toward community college classes that fall, and she knew it. "You gambled your tuition money on a building that flooded once already," Renata said, not quite a question. "I know how it looks," Emmett answered. "Does it look different to you?" she asked. And he didn't have a fast answer for that yet. Dorsey was blunter about it a few days later, standing with Emmett outside the building for the first time since the sale. "Tear this thing down and you might still come out behind," Dorsey said, kicking at a chunk of buckled asphalt near the loading doors. Emmett didn't argue with him. He just unlocked the padlock on the side door and stepped inside to see for himself what $1,200 had actually bought him. The smell hit him before anything else, a heavy, stale, mildew smell that had settled into the walls over 4 years of sitting closed. His flashlight beam crossed warped shelving that had buckled and split from years of moisture. Some of it collapsed entirely onto the floor. Bags of old feed sat rotted in the corners, chewed through by mice, spilling a fine gray dust across the concrete. Papers in the small office had fused together into a solid, waterlogged block on what used to be a desk. Rust had eaten through most of the metal shelving brackets, and 2 of the overhead lights hung dead and disconnected from the ceiling. For a long moment, standing there with the flashlight and the smell, Emmett understood exactly why nobody else had bid on this building. Then he started paying attention to what was underneath the mess, instead of just the mess itself. The concrete floor, filthy as it was still solid, without the cracking or heaving he'd expected after a flood that size. The loading apron outside, cracked in places, was still wide enough and flat enough for a full-size truck to back up against without trouble. Toward the back of the building, past the ruined retail shelving, he found the old bulk bins still standing, elevated off the floor on their steel frames, dented but structurally intact. A covered loading lane ran along one side, still usable, still capable of keeping rain off a truck being loaded or unloaded. And near the scale house, half buried under years of blown leaves and dust, sat the old platform scale itself, the same one Emmett remembered from his childhood, watching farm trucks roll across it years before the flood ever came. He stood there a long moment, running the flashlight over the scale's steel deck, doing the same quiet math he imagined every serious buyer had skipped that morning out of habit. The building looked worthless because of what had happened to it, but the bones underneath, the floor, the apron, the bins, the scale, none of that had washed away with everything else. His first idea, once the shock of ownership wore off, was the obvious one. He would clean the place up, restock it, and reopen it as a feed store, the same business it had always been before the water came. He spent a few weeks pricing out what that would actually take. New shelving, a starting inventory of bagged feed and supplies, enough stock to look like a real store instead of an empty room with a counter. The numbers were bad almost immediately. Halbrook Farm Supply, where he still worked part-time, was 15 minutes away and already carried every brand a local farmer might want. With buying power Emmett couldn't hope to match as a one-man operation just getting started. A regional chain store had opened 2 counties over the year before, undercutting smaller feed dealers on price across half the region. Bagged feed margins were thin under the best circumstances, and tying up what little capital he had into shelves of inventory that might sit unsold for months felt like a fast way to lose the building all over again, just more slowly this time. He talked it over with Dorsey one evening, laying out the numbers on a sheet of notebook paper. "You can't outstock Halbrook, and you sure can't outstock that chain store," Dorsey said, tapping the page. "I know," Emmett said. "So what's the building good for then?" Dorsey asked. And that question sat with Emmett for longer than he expected. The answer came slowly, the way it usually did, not from sitting and thinking, but from paying attention to something he'd been hearing his whole life without really hearing it. At the counter at Halbrook, Emmett dealt with small farmers constantly, ringing up orders for 2 tons of cattle feed, 3 tons, sometimes barely 1.5 tons. He knew, because the store's own pricing sheet made it obvious, that the per-ton price dropped significantly once an order crossed into truckload quantities, something like 18 or 20 tons at once. None of the small farmers he rang up could use that much feed before it went stale, and none of them had anywhere to store it even if they could. One afternoon, a cattle farmer named Otha Reeves stood at the counter, grumbling about the same thing Emmett had heard 100 times before, this time about the delivery fee eating into whatever savings he'd hoped to get from a slightly better bag price. If I could buy like the big operations do, I'd save real money, Otha said, mostly to himself. Emmett asked him a question he hadn't asked before, not out of politeness this time, but because he actually wanted the answer. How much would it help if 5 or 6 of you bought together? Emmett asked. Otha stopped and looked at him for a second, like the question hadn't occurred to him either. Never really thought about doing that, Otha said. Nobody's got anywhere central to bring it in and split it up. Emmett thought about the old scale sitting behind his flooded building, dusty and unused, and about the loading apron wide enough for a full-size truck, and about bins built to hold exactly the kind of bulk product Otha was describing. He didn't need to reopen a feed store to compete with Halbrook or the chain 2 counties over. He needed to become the place where small orders turned into one big order at a price none of those farmers could get on their own. That was the real business hiding underneath the flood damage, and it had nothing to do with restocking shelves. Before he could build anything on that idea, though, he had to deal with the scale itself, since a dusty steel deck sitting unused for 4 years wasn't automatically ready to weigh a farm truck's worth of feed. He called a scale service company out of the next county, and a technician named Purnell Voss came out to look it over. Purnell walked the platform, checked the mechanical structure underneath, and ran a few tests with a handheld meter before giving Emmett his assessment. Steel deck solid, foundation looks fine, Purnell said, but your load cells are shot, and the readout electronics are older than you are. He explained that replacing the load cells and electronics would run a few $1,000s, not nothing, but nowhere close to what a brand new commercial scale system would cost installed from scratch somewhere else. And even once it's working mechanically, Purnell added, it's not legal for commercial transactions until the State Weights and Measures Office comes out and certifies it. Emmett asked how long that usually took. Depends on their schedule, Purnell said, but once you're repaired, I can get the inspection request moving. It wasn't free money sitting behind the building, the way it might have looked at first glance, but repairing the useful parts still cost far less than starting over somewhere new, and Emmett scraped together enough from his savings and a small loan from Dorsey to get the repair started. While the scale work was underway, Emmett began talking to more farmers than just Otha, asking the same simple questions at the Halbrook counter and around town whenever the subject came up naturally. How much do you normally buy? How often? What does delivery cost you? What would you do if 5 farms bought together? Would you be willing to pay part of an order up front to lock in a price? The answers built a clearer picture with every conversation. Small farmers weren't paying more because feed itself cost more to make. They were paying more because they were buying in quantities too small to access the pricing that bulk buyers took for granted, and nobody nearby had ever given them a way to combine their orders. By the time the scale repair was finished and Purnell had scheduled the state certification inspection, Emmett had a rough plan and 5 farmers cautiously willing to try it. Most of them people Dorsey knew personally, which made the early trust easier to come by than it might have been otherwise. The state inspector came out on a Tuesday morning, ran a series of test weights across the platform, checked the readout against known values, and signed off on the certification without much ceremony. Emmett watched the whole process from a few feet away, feeling more nervous about a stack of paperwork than he had about anything since the day he raised his hand at the auction. You're good to operate commercially, the inspector told him, handing over the certificate. That piece of paper mattered more than almost anything else he owned by that point, since without it, the scale was just an old piece of steel taking up space behind the building. The first pooled order came together carefully. Otha Reeves committed to 2.5 tons. A poultry farmer named Wilhelmina Cross committed to 3. A young hog producer named Desmond Falk, a small dairy operation, and a goat farmer rounded out the group, bringing the total somewhere around 14 tons, not a full truckload yet, but enough to unlock a meaningfully better price than any of them could get buying alone. Emmett required a small deposit from each of them before he placed the order, not because he doubted their word, but because he didn't have the cash to front a large purchase and absorb the loss if someone changed their mind. Otha grumbled about the deposit at first, then paid it anyway, mostly out of curiosity to see whether the idea actually worked. The truck arrived on a Thursday morning, and Emmett guided it onto the newly certified scale himself, watching the display climb and settle on a number that matched the supplier's paperwork almost exactly. He split the load by hand that first time, checking each farmer's ticket against what they'd ordered, weighing out portions carefully in the loading lane, while Dorsey helped keep things organized. By the end of the day, 5 farmers had picked up exactly what they'd ordered, at a price meaningfully better than any of them had managed on their own, and Emmett had earned a modest handling margin on top of what the feed itself had cost him. It wasn't a lot of money yet, but it was proof, and proof mattered more than profit at that stage. Word moved slowly through the county the way it always did, carried mostly by farmers talking to other farmers rather than anything Emmett said himself. By the end of that first year, 8 to 10 farmers were placing pooled orders through him on a semi-regular basis, and Emmett had settled into a rough rhythm: collect commitments and deposits, place the order once the tonnage justified a better price, weigh the truck in on the certified scale, split the load by ticket, and let farmers pick up on schedule. Going into the second year, demand kept growing and growth brought a temptation Emmett hadn't fully prepared himself for. A supplier representative mentioned, almost in passing, that a slightly larger order that quarter would unlock an even better per-ton price, one that would make the whole operation noticeably more attractive to farmers on the edge of trying it. Emmett had 7 farmers firmly committed that cycle, enough tonnage to justify a decent order on its own. But to hit the better pricing tier, he needed roughly 6 more tons than his committed customers had signed up for. A larger hog operation 2 farms over had mentioned interest earlier that month without ever actually confirming a number. Emmett told himself it was close enough to a sure thing, and he placed the larger order anyway, counting on that hog operation to take the remaining tonnage once the truck arrived. The hog operation backed out 3 days before delivery, citing a cash flow problem of their own that had nothing to do with Emmett at all. By then, the order was already locked in with the supplier, and the truck was already scheduled. Emmett told himself it would be fine for a few days, that he'd find another buyer for the extra tonnage before it became a real problem. He didn't have covered storage sized for that much uncommitted excess, so the surplus feed sat stacked near the edge of the loading lane under a tarp that wasn't quite up to the job. A stretch of humid weather rolled through that week, and moisture worked its way into the stacked bags faster than Emmett expected, clumping and souring a portion of the surplus before he managed to move any of it. By the time he found a buyer willing to take some of the extra tonnage at a steep discount, close to a third of the original surplus was unusable, fit for nothing but disposal. The loss ate through most of the margin he'd built up over the previous several months, and it did something worse to his standing with the supplier, who had extended him modest trust based on his early payment record and now watched him scramble to cover a late invoice caused entirely by his own miscalculation. Word of the spoiled feed moved through the same channels that had carried his early success, and a couple of farmers who'd been considering their first order that season decided to wait and see how things settled. Emmett sat with Dorsey one evening after the worst of it, going over what had actually gone wrong. "You ordered more than anybody promised you," Dorsey said, not unkindly, just stating it plainly. "I know," Emmett said. "I thought it was close enough." "Close enough isn't a number," Dorsey said, and that line stuck with Emmett longer than almost anything else from that whole stretch. The real insight didn't come from the spoiled feed itself, but from sitting with why he'd ordered it in the first place. The business only worked because it turned small, uncertain individual demand into one large, certain order before ever spending real money. The moment he'd ordered tonnage that wasn't actually committed, he'd stopped running a coordination business and started running a speculative one, guessing at demand the same way the old feed store used to guess at what customers might buy off its shelves. That was the mistake, and it wasn't bad luck. He'd known the hog operation hadn't confirmed anything, and he'd ordered anyway because the better price was too tempting to pass up. Out of that failure came the rule that shaped everything the business became afterward: no purchase order without committed tonnage, backed by a deposit, signed before the truck was ever scheduled. He built the system out properly over the following months, the way he probably should have from the start. Every farmer now had to commit to a specific tonnage by a set cutoff date before an order went in, with a deposit locked in to back that commitment. Order tickets tracked exactly who had signed up for what, cross-referenced against the scale receipt once the truck arrived, so nothing moved through the loading lane without a name already attached to it. He stopped keeping any meaningful unallocated inventory on hand, holding only a small buffer for minor adjustments instead of speculative surplus. He improved moisture protection in the storage area, moved the small buffer stock onto pallets well off the floor, and started checking humidity levels regularly instead of assuming a tarp would hold. Rebuilding trust with the supplier took longer than building the system had, since Emmett had to pay down the late invoice fully before the relationship went back to anything resembling normal terms. He went back to farmers who'd pulled away after the spoilage, not with excuses, but with the new deposit and commitment system laid out plainly, showing them exactly how the mistake wouldn't happen again. Some came back quickly. Others took most of a season to decide the risk was worth trying again. As the system stabilized, a second insight started to surface, one that mattered almost as much as the first. Farmers didn't just want a better price. They wanted to know exactly when their feed would be there, instead of an open-ended promise that it would show up sometime once enough people signed on. Emmett began scheduling fixed order days, cattle feed loads every other Tuesday, poultry feed on Thursdays during the busier months, mineral supplement loads timed to the season. That predictability did almost as much for the business as the pricing itself, since farmers could plan their own operations around a schedule they knew they could count on. The scale sat at the center of all of it by that point, more than Emmett had expected when he first got it repaired. Every ticket, every allocation, every dispute about who got what portion of a load traced back to a number printed off that platform. One afternoon, two farmers argued briefly over whether one load had come out slightly heavier on someone else's portion, and Emmett settled it in under a minute by pulling the scale receipt and matching it against both order tickets. If it doesn't cross the scale, it doesn't go on the ticket, he told them, not as a slogan, just as a plain fact about how the operation worked. Neither farmer argued with a printed number the way they might have argued with Emmett's word alone, and disputes like that became rare after word got around about how strictly he tracked it. The supplier relationship kept improving. As Emmett's order volume grew steadier and his payment record stayed clean after the spoilage incident, by the middle of the second year, the supplier had shifted him onto a regular delivery schedule instead of treating each order as a one-off request, and had started extending limited short-term credit terms, small at first, expanded gradually as Emmett proved he could be trusted with them. A local credit union scene came later that year, when Emmett needed a modest working capital loan to cover the gap between placing larger orders and collecting final payments from farmers on pickup day. The loan officer, a careful woman named Priscilla Odom, wasn't unkind, but she wasn't quick to say yes either. "You want us to finance feed orders for people who aren't your employees and haven't signed any contract with your business," she said, reading through his application. Emmett laid out what he had: deposit records, signed tonnage commitments, scale receipts going back over a year, supplier invoices showing steady on-time payments since the spoilage incident, and a growing list of repeat customers. Priscilla went quiet for a moment, flipping through the pages more slowly than she had at the start. "This is more organized than I expected," she said eventually, and the credit union approved a modest line of working capital that smoothed out the timing gaps that had been straining his cash flow. The flood risk never fully went away, and Emmett never pretended it had. He raised the electrical panels and sensitive equipment well above the old water line, still faintly visible on the brick outside, kept only short-term committed inventory rather than large speculative stock, and paid closer attention to weather forecasts during the rainy stretches of spring than most people in town probably thought was necessary. That attention paid off during a heavy storm the following spring, when several days of rain pushed the creek behind the property close enough to the edge of the lot that Emmett spent an anxious afternoon watching the water line from the loading dock. He moved what little buffer inventory he had onto raised pallets, shut down the scale's electronics as a precaution, and waited it out with Dorsey parked nearby in case anything needed hauling out fast. The water came closer than Emmett liked, but it stopped short of the building, and by the next morning the creek had dropped back within its banks. Nothing was lost, no equipment damaged, no product ruined, not because the risk had disappeared, but because he'd built the operation around the assumption that it never would. By the third year, the business Emmett was running bore little resemblance to the flooded, abandoned building he'd bought for $1,200. 30 or more farmers placed regular orders through him by that point, feed remaining the core product, with a cautious expansion into one mineral supplement line that farmers had specifically asked him to add once they trusted the system with feed. He'd hired one part-time helper to manage loading during the busiest scheduled days, and the scheduled order days themselves had become something farmers built their own routines around, the way they might plan around a market day or a co-op meeting. Revenue that third year passed $500,000, driven mostly by the sheer volume of product moving through the facility on its way from supplier to farmer. Emmett's own earnings came from a modest per-ton margin built into each order, along with the handling and weighing fees charged at pickup, not from owning or marking up the feed itself. Emmett tracked the difference between that number and what he actually kept just as carefully as he tracked incoming tonnage, since the overwhelming majority of that revenue went straight back out to cover product cost, trucking, scale maintenance, insurance, utilities, property taxes, and the wages for his one part-time employee. What was left over was modest compared to the total volume passing through, but steady, and built entirely on repeat business rather than any single large win. One afternoon that fall, a familiar truck pulled onto the lot, and Emmett recognized the driver before the man had fully parked. It was the same older farmer who'd called out about the flood at the auction 3 years earlier, a man named Garrison Teal, who ran a modest cattle operation on the far side of the county and had never once used Emmett's service in all that time. Garrison walked up slowly, glancing at the scale, the loading lane, the neat row of order tickets clipped to the board near the office door. "Cattle feed load today?" Emmett asked. 4 tons, Garrison said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Pull forward when the light turns green," Emmett told him, checking the board. Garrison nodded once, walked back to his truck, and waited his turn in line like everyone else. No mention of the flood, no apology, no acknowledgement of what he'd said 3 years before. None was needed. At home, the changes were smaller but steady, the way they always seemed to be with things built slowly instead of all at once. Dorsey's cattle operation stopped scrambling for emergency feed purchases at high prices during tight stretches, since pooled orders now kept a predictable supply moving through on schedule. Renata's old car finally got the repairs it had needed for over a year. No longer something she had to worry about every time she needed to drive across town. Emmett enrolled in community college classes that fall, paying his own way with money the business had generated rather than the tuition savings he'd nearly gambled away at the auction 3 years earlier. None of it happened overnight, and none of it made the family wealthy, but the tight financial pressure that used to sit over every season eased into something closer to steady, predictable footing. That evening, as the last farm truck of the day rolled off the scale, the printer behind the counter clicked out a final weight ticket, the paper curling slightly as it fed through. Emmett tore it off, checked it against the day's board, and reached over to switch off the scales display for the night. Behind him, the warehouse sat mostly empty, bulk bins bare except for the small buffer stock he kept on raised pallets, since almost everything that had come through that week already had a name attached to it before the delivery truck ever pulled onto the lot. Outside, the faded outline of the old sign still hung crooked above the door, Feed and S barely readable in the evening light, and along the brick wall beneath it, the old waterline from the flood remained exactly where it had always been, faint but visible, right below the newer conduit Emmett had run well above it years before. He hadn't erased what the building used to survive. He'd simply learned to build around it, one certified weight ticket at a time.